welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight, wherever you are in the world. Whatever time it may be, perhaps the hush of early morning or the stillness of a midnight hour, we're glad you're here. If you're new to the channel, or if you find yourself enjoying these long, quiet journeys into forgotten corners of the past, feel free to subscribe. And while you're settling in, feel free to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let your shoulders drop just a little, loosen your jaw. Let the tension slowly melt down through your arms and fingers. You're not required to do anything right now but listen. Or not even that, if sleep begins to take hold. This space is made for drifting. Tonight, we turn the heavy pages of a darker, quieter chapter in the story of human civilization, a chapter that unfolds slowly across the cobbled streets, silent abbeys, smoky hearts, and stone-walled keeps of medieval Europe. The world we enter was shaped not just by plagues and popes, knights and kings, but by something more mundane, more unsettling, and strangely intimate, from the creaking of the pillory to the eerie solemnity of the executioner's stride. We will explore how pain and shame were woven into the daily rhythms of life, not as anomalies, but as customs, a way to maintain order, a mirror of the world they believed in. Yet as we journey into this age of heavy cloth and muddy boots, of thick wooden doors and whispered Latin prayers, we won't dwell in horror or revulsion. We'll drift quietly through it all, observing, understanding, occasionally pausing to feel the wind against a stone tower or hear the distant toll of a church bell. Let's begin where all things human begin, with daily life. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow street in a small medieval town, perhaps in England, around the year 1320. The dawn light is pale and milky, just beginning to filter through the thatched rooftops and slatted shutters. The air is thick with the scent of hard smoke, damp timber, and the faint, sour tang of yesterday's livestock. Shops are beginning to stir open, wooden shutters creaking, iron latches clinking. Bakers with soot-darkened hands arrange their loaves near windows, and the tanner trudges by with stiff leather slung over his shoulder. At the centre of town, in the open square where townsfolk gather to gossip, trade, and resolve disputes, stands something utterly ordinary for the time, the pillory, to stout wooden posts, connected by a board with 3 holes, one for the head, and one for each hand. The wood is weathered, darkened by countless seasons of rain and sun. It is not empty. A man stands there, neck and hands locked in place, unmoving. Some passers-by glance his way. One boy tosses a piece of hardened bread. A woman sneers under her breath, but most simply continue on, as though he were no more unusual than the well or the lantern hook or the barrel of salted fish. Punishment was not hidden. It was not confined to prisons or whispered about behind walls. It was seen, lived with, accepted, part of the everyday scenery, visible and normalized. Those accused of theft might find themselves there for a full day, exposed not just to the elements, but to the judgment of neighbors. Others, branded or shamed, carried their punishments with them like the mark of a hot iron seared into the skin, or a shaved head that proclaimed disgrace. And many of these penalties were designed not only to deter but to display, to make the offense part of your body, your smell, your gait. Punishment was time. It was weather. It was visibility. And yet, for most people, these penalties were something to witness from the outside. You might hurry past a pilloried soul with your market basket in hand. You might mutter a quiet prayer for someone awaiting flogging. You might simply look the other way. There was no expectation that justice be swift, clean, or anonymous. It was meant to be seen and endured, slowly, publicly, repetitively. Even in the small rhythms of daily life, baking, fetching water, gossiping at the well, the awareness of punishment loomed. The pillory in the square, the stocks near the chapel, the dark stories told at night of thieves who'd lost fingers, not with malice, necessarily, but as a reminder, a signpost in the fog, and in the background, always, the church bells rang, hour by hour, keeping time for a world where morality, order, and fear were braided together. So we begin here, In the town square, as another pale morning brightens the stone beneath your feet, we will remain for a while, drifting further into this world, and soon we'll follow a particular figure whose life wove directly through the mechanisms of justice. But for now, let's linger a bit longer in the cobbled rhythms of medieval life. Let us now follow the quiet footsteps of a man seldom remembered in medieval lore, yet ever present in the margins of daily justice, the town beadle. Not a judge, not a nobleman, but a public servant of the town or parish, tasked with maintaining order, enforcing minor penalties, and ensuring that the machinery of punishment did not fall into disuse. You might imagine him walking slowly down the main street, his heavy cloak catching a chill wind, a short stave or rod in one hand, not a weapon, but a symbol of his office. His boots, caked with mud from morning patrols, leave fading tracks behind him as he moves from house to house, gate to gate. His duties vary by town, but they are consistent in tone, announcing local bylaws in the square, inspecting shops for unfair weights, dragging the disorderly from the alehouse at curfew, and most visibly escorting offenders to their punishments. He knows the names of most everyone, not out of intimacy, but necessity. He knows who cheated the market stall last week, who spread seditious gossip, who refuses to keep their chimney swept. He knows the tone of voice that signals a brewing brawl, and the silence that follows the arrival of a Lord's messenger. The beadle does not pass judgment. He is not a man of sentences or decrees. He is, rather, the quiet hand that moves justice from parchment to pavement. He fastens the stocks in the early morning. He places the wooden mask of shame carved into a grotesque face onto the head of a local scold. He supervises the whipping post, records fines, carries notices from the manor court to the townsfolk. He might seem a figure of annoyance more than terror, but his presence is constant, practical, unembellished. The beadle is not feared because he is cruel. He is feared because he is inevitable. When he knocks at your door, punishment is already underway. His life is a slow rhythm of errands, reports, inspections, and quiet talks with priests and elders. There is no glamour to the role, nor great wealth. But there is power, of a soft and creeping kind, the power of visibility, of observation, of being the one person who knows every corner of both law and street. In some towns, the beadle also keeps the keys to the local jail, where those sentenced to confinement not often, but sometimes wait behind rough iron grates. He knows who gets bread and who does not. He chooses when the door creaks open and when it stays shut. You might find him one evening standing beneath the eaves of the chapel, watching the mist curl over the graveyard stones, not praying, not mourning, just listening to the murmurs of townsfolk, to the distant hoofbeats of a rider, to the occasional clang of a blacksmith working late. The beadle is not often remembered by name, but his footsteps echo through the town square long after he's gone, because in a world ruled as much by fear as by faith, someone always had to hold the key, light the torch, or lift the latch on the pillory's wooden clasp. So tonight, we pause and remember this quiet figure, the keeper of small punishments, the walker of muddy lanes, the silent thread in the fabric of everyday justice. And as he returns to his narrow chamber at the edge of the market, as the oil lamp flickers low on his table, we leave him to rest and turn our gaze to stranger customs still, hidden in the folds of culture and belief. Across the towns and villages of medieval Europe, punishment did not simply occur, it was staged, deliberate, methodical, a kind of performance whose audience was everyone, and whose purpose was more than retribution. It was instruction. The square, the green, the churchyard steps, these were the theatres of justice, and the rituals that played out there were not only to inflict pain or shame, but to demonstrate visibly that order had been restored, that law had spoken, that sin had been marked and contained. Imagine the slow processional of a condemned individual being led to the scaffold not by force, necessarily, but through ritual. The bell might toll from the steeple, low and steady. A clerk might read the charges aloud in a calm, even voice. The townsfolk gather not in panic, but in practice curiosity. Children perched on barrels, elders seated quietly on stone walls, shopkeepers momentarily closing shutters. The event unfolds not with speed, but with pauses, statements, gestures, a hand raised, a confession murmured, a prayer offered. In some cases, even executioners took part in the pageantry. In larger cities, their garb was ceremonial: a red hood or coat, a belt bearing symbols of their role. They might be known by name, and they sometimes received payments in the form of bread, wine, or coins tossed by spectators. Punishment was thus woven into the very fabric of communal life, not an aberration, but a confirmation of structure. And as the penalty was enacted, whether a whipping, a branding, or something harsher, the crowd did not cry out or riot. They watched, and then, just as slowly, they dispersed. The fishmonger's stall reopened. Children ran toward the fountain. The world resumed its rhythm, now slightly altered by the reminder of its rules. There were other rituals, quieter and less violent, yet equally performative. A woman accused of false speech had been made to walk barefoot through town, holding a candle and reciting a formal apology. A dishonest trader might be required to stand beside his wares with a sign around his neck, declaring his offense in block letters. These acts, though humiliating, were precise, controlled, understood. They were messages, spoken not with words alone, but with posture, silence, and presence. Even the architecture of towns mirrored this ethos. Some marketplaces included a permanent scaffold or wooden platform, not always in use, but always in view, a reminder, a stage. In many towns, market days were chosen for punishment, precisely because more people would be there to witness it. The idea was not to hide justice, but to share it, to etch it into memory, to let the lesson settle into the bones of the community, quietly but lastingly. This blending of punishment and performance reveals something essential about medieval life: that justice was not just a matter of law, but of story. Each sentence carried a moral, each spectacle conveyed a truth. And in the telling and retelling, in the watching and remembering, society knit itself together stitch by quiet stitch. And so, as we leave behind the hushed murmurs of the crowd and the echoing footsteps of the condemned, we turn now to the other side of justice, to those for whom the law did not always apply the same way, those who stood above it, or behind it, cloaked in privilege and shielded by name. In the world of medieval justice, not all lives were weighed on the same scale. Beneath the soaring arches of castle halls and behind the woven tapestries of noble chambers, a different rhythm of punishment stirred, one marked more by negotiation, honor, and discretion than by spectacle or pain. For nobles, knights, and those of elevated birth, the consequences of wrongdoing were often filtered through layers of influence, lineage, and favor. Where a peasant might lose a hand for theft, a baron might pay a fine. Where a commoner might face public shame, a noble might simply endure a quiet reprimand within his manor walls. Imagine a stone hall lined with flickering torches. A lord sits at the far end, robes trimmed with fur, a signet ring glinting faintly. Before him kneels, not a criminal in rags, but a young knight in travel-stained armor, accused of striking another noble in anger. There are no stocks here, no branding iron. Instead, the discussion turns to restitution, to land agreements, to oaths renewed. The punishment might be exile from court for a season, or the forfeiture of a prized hunting estate. Or if the offense involved a matter of blood, perhaps a carefully arranged duel, sanctioned and witnessed under a silent sky at dawn. Nobles were often tried by their peers, rather than by local courts. This practiced trial by one's equals reflected the feudal belief that honor and status required judgment from those who truly understood their weight. And when such trials took place, they were usually quiet, deliberative affairs, removed from the noise and scrutiny of the marketplace. This wasn't to say nobles could do as they pleased. Kings still held sway. Feuds could turn deadly. Treason could bring ruin. But the path to punishment was paved differently, less by law, more by custom, alliance, and strategy. Even in the darkest outcomes, when a noble was condemned to death, the execution was marked by formality and gravity. A noble beheading might occur within castle walls, witnessed only by chosen eyes, accompanied by solemn rites and velvet robes. The blade might be carried in a silken cloth. The condemned might pen final letters, seal them with wax, and arrange their own burial. Justice, for the upper echelons, was clothed in dignity. It was designed not to humiliate, but to preserve appearances. It operated not in public squares, but in drawing rooms, corridors, and councils, and beyond the walls of nobility. The townspeople watched. They knew the rules were not the same. They whispered stories of injustices borne silently. But they also understood the world as a tapestry of hierarchies. That was simply how it was. As we leave the corridors of noble privilege and return to the common roads of justice, we'll next immerse ourselves once more in the lives of everyday folk, those for whom punishment was neither distant nor ceremonial, but part of the very air they breathed. In the smaller villages, tucked between hedgerows and bordered by tilled earth, justice often took on a gentler, but no less persistent form. Less adorned, less ritualized, and more deeply ingrained into the rhythm of communal life. At the heart of many of these settlements stood a simple wooden device, rough-hewn, weather-darkened, and unmistakable, the stocks, often placed near the church gate or beside the common green. The stocks were not grand or ominous. They did not tower or glint with metal. Rather, they sat squat and still, waiting. And most days, they remained empty, but not always. Imagine a late summer afternoon. The sun hangs low, casting long shadows across the thatched rooftops. Children chase one another past rows of onions drying in the sun. And there, seated with legs secured in the heavy wood of the stocks, is a man middle-aged, his face calm but resigned. Perhaps he spoke too harshly to the reeve. Perhaps he failed to pay a tithe in time. Or perhaps his offence was something as common as public drunkenness on a feast day. There is no jeering crowd, no procession. A few neighbours pass, murmuring soft greetings. Someone sets a small loaf near his side. Time passes slowly, but not cruelly. The punishment is not in the pain. It is in the stillness, the exposure, the pause. Stocks were often used for minor transgressions, offences that did not merit whipping or fines, but were deemed worthy of correction. Gossip, disorder, petty disputes, these were the kinds of faults the stocks sought to contain. And because they were so integrated into the village's physical and emotional landscape, they carried a special kind of weight, not terrifying, but humbling. Everyone knew them. Children grew up walking past them. Elders remembered their own turns. It was not rare to know someone directly or distantly who had once sat with their ankles held fast, eyes lowered, waiting for the bells to chime and the hours to pass. There was an almost meditative quality to it. An invitation to reflect, to be seen, but not heard. To endure, but not collapse. No shouting, no chains. Just wood, silence, and time. In many ways, this was the heart of rural justice, a system not obsessed with punishment for its own sake, but with preservation of peace, with discouraging disruption without dismantling the person. And so the stocks remained familiar, worn smooth by decades of use, standing quietly in their corner of the world, always waiting, always ready to remind. As the sun dips lower and the air turns cool, we leave the village green and begin our next journey into the life of one whose experiences with punishment left deeper marks on the annals of history. In the mid-13th century, in a modest English township not far from Norwich, lived a man whose story has largely faded from written memory, but whose life offers a gentle window into the slow-moving gears of medieval justice. His name was Thomas of Eldham. Thomas was not a figure of drama or renown. He was no lord, no outlaw. He was, in the simplest sense, a tanner, a man who worked hides in strong-smelling vats, elbow-deep in water thick with lime and soaked bark. His hands were calloused, stained, and always moving, but like many, Thomas carried within him a quiet frustration. It wasn't rebellion, just a thread of discontent, a sharp word here, a grumbled refusal there. He paid his taxes, though not always promptly. He observed feast days, though not always reverently. One autumn morning, following a disagreement at the market over the price of salted meat, Thomas struck a man, not with a weapon, not with intent to maim, but with a single, swift backhand in full view of two other tradesmen. The matter could have ended in a fine, but the other manor cooper named Alan was favoured by the Reeve, and so a formal complaint was drawn up. Thomas was summoned. He appeared, as expected, before the manorial court, a gathering of village elders, a priest, a scribe, and the Reeve himself. The court met outdoors, beneath the large oak near the chapel, its trunk worn smooth by decades of leanings and whispered words. Thomas did not deny the strike. He simply explained tiredness, the weight of debt, the sourness of spoiled heights, but explanation was not exemption. The judgment was handed down plainly. 2 days in the stocks, plus a public confession at the Sunday Mass. There was no anger in Thomas, no outburst. He nodded once, slowly, and returned home to prepare. What followed was not unusual. He sat, as many had before him, with legs secured and face exposed. He endured the quiet passage of time, the murmurs of neighbours, the occasional glance from a passing child. And on Sunday, dressed in his cleanest tunic, he stood near the chapel entrance and declared his contrition in a steady voice. But what makes Thomas memorable is what followed. In the months after his punishment, he began to speak differently. Softer, slower, not defeated, but aware. He offered his apprentices longer hours of rest. He paid the fishwife in full, even when prices surged. And he sat more often near the hearth, listening as others spoke. Thomas was not transformed by punishment, not in the way legends claim. But he was altered, gently, nudged. The justice he received did not end his life, it wove itself into it, quietly. By the time he died, some 20 years later, he was a man known not for his temper, but for his fairness. And the stocks, long replaced by newer wood, still bore faint scratches where his ankles once rested. His is a life not marked by fame or tragedy, but by the slow, cyclical nature of consequence. A reminder that punishment, in its gentlest forms, could reshape a life just as surely as it could end one. Now, with Thomas's memory settled and still, we turn once more toward mystery not of men, but of tools and texts, strange customs and enduring questions that hover at the edges of historical certainty. In the corners of museums, behind panes of glass and softened light, there occasionally sits a strange object, often iron, sometimes painted wood sculpted into the crude likeness of a human face. Exaggerated features, grimaces, long tongues, eyes bulging or crossed. This is not a piece of art. It is a shanmaske mask, and while its precise use varied from place to place, it served one enduring purpose in medieval justice, to turn punishment into symbol. Unlike the stocks or the whip, the mask of shame did not inflict pain. It was not physical. Instead, it was a mirror held to the community, a statement. Imagine, if you will, a small town square in the Germanic lands, the 15th century. Cobblestones still damp from early fog, a gathering of neighbours, some headed to market, others lingering near the chapel doors, and there, standing near the well, is a woman wearing one of these masks. It is heavy, awkward, difficult to balance. The design might feature a pig's snout, a forked tongue, or ears pulled into great points, each shape selected to represent the perceived nature of her offence. Perhaps she was accused of spreading gossip, or of speaking with scorn about her neighbour's bread. Perhaps she raised her voice too loudly during counsel. The exact charge doesn't always survive in records, but the punishment is clear, be seen, be interpreted. No one throws stones, no one shouts. They simply glance, murmur, move along. The shame rests not in agony, but in attention. Such punishments were especially common in the Holy Roman Empire and in portions of Eastern Europe. They were used for both men and women, though most often for the latter. Sometimes they were accompanied by a sign or placard hung about the neck with a brief description. Other times, the mask itself did the speaking. These masks remind us that medieval punishment was not always about harm. It was often about metaphor. To wear the face of a liar, a scold, or a glutton was to become a living emblem of what should not be. And unlike the lash or the fine, the memory of the mask lingered. Even after it was removed, the face beneath it was changed, at least in the minds of those who had watched. This kind of justice worked not through fear, but through containment. It offered the community a symbol upon which to rest its discomforts, and it allowed those symbols to walk among them, quietly reinforcing the norms that shaped everyday life. Today, we look at such masks with curiosity, sometimes even amusement. But in their time, they were serious, effective, a language unto themselves. And so, we continue to drift through this tapestry of punishments, not always loud, not always bloody, but always deliberate, always deeply woven into the stories people told each other about right, wrong, and the strange space in between. Now, we gently pull away from these symbolic punishments and into the guarded world of those for whom punishment rarely touched, those insulated not by title, but by coin. In a world without banknotes or modern insurance, wealth in medieval Europe was felt and seen measured in bolts of cloth, in land, in livestock, in coin that rang when struck upon a table. And while nobles had their titles and clergy their robes, the merchant and the wealthy commoner held a different kind of shield, silver. Punishment, in theory, applied to all. The laws were written with universal language. But in practice, the outcomes often bent and swayed beneath the weight of wealth. Picture a prosperous merchant in the bustling port town of Bruges. His shop is lined with imported cloth, spices, wax, and brass. His ledgers are tidy. His apprentice is loyal. His donations to the church visible in the new candles lit each Sunday. One spring, a dispute arises. A shipment of goods is miscounted. A rival accuses him of theft of dishonest weights. A trial follows. Now, he is not immune to justice. He appears before the city council, answers questions. The town scribe dutifully records his responses. Witnesses are called, but when judgment comes, it is not the pillory, not the stocks, not public display. Instead, it is a fine, and not a small one, 20 florins, enough to sting, but paid within the week, without complaint. And with the payment comes the unspoken message: the matter is closed. The merchant returns to his shop. The candles still burn, the shutters still open. Fines were the primary form of punishment for the wealthy, and they carried a distinct logic. To remove time from a man whose wealth was measured in hours sold, in markets travelled, in ledgers filled, was more disruptive than bruises or shame. To extract coin was to remind, to inconvenience, but not to unmake. Moreover, these fines often returned, in part, to the very systems that issued them, to churches, to councils, to guilds. They helped sustain the order they enforced. This practice wasn't hidden. Everyone saw it. A peasant might grumble, a craftsman might whisper, but it was not new, nor unexpected. The system acknowledged inequality openly. The man with coin could keep his dignity intact provided he paid for the privilege. The man without it endured the lash, the mud, the watching eyes. Some towns even offered formal policies, compositio. They were called in parts of Italy and France a system of commuted penalties. You pay, and in exchange, avoid harsher outcomes. It was official, legal, and very much expected. This reality added a quiet layer of tension to medieval society. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't outrage. It was a steady hum of awareness that coin, carefully stacked and safely held, could bend the very beam of justice. And so, in the silent calculations of the marketplace, every merchant knew the true weight of his earnings, not just in goods or trade but in freedom. From this subtle architecture of class and coin, we turn next to the fields, once soaked with echoes, the places where justice was loud, visible, and final. where not wealth, nor rank, nor ritual could prevent the closing of a door or the tolling of a bell. On the outskirts of nearly every medieval town or city, just beyond the final row of cottages and the last tolling bell of the church, there lay a hill or open field, often bare, sometimes marked with a simple wooden post, and in other cases with a scaffold of timbers. It was a place known by all, though spoken of only in hushed tones, the gallows. It was not hidden. In fact, its visibility was the point. The structure stood tall and unadorned, offering a stark silhouette against the grey sky, and its position just outside the limits of daily commerce and worship signalled its liminality. Neither part of daily life, nor wholly separate from it. A space of transition, finality. Gallows executions were rare, not daily occurrences. They were reserved for serious crimes, murder, high theft, repeated offences, or matters deemed treasonous by the local authorities. And while the sentence itself was grim, the process was slow, almost ceremonial. When the day came, the town would know. A procession began. Sometimes a bell rang in steady intervals. The condemned would be led through the streets, not hurried, not dragged, but flanked by watchmen, often with a priest nearby murmuring soft prayers in Latin or the local tongue. The people gathered not in rage, but in solemn curiosity. Children perched on shoulders, elders leaned on staffs. Bakers, shepherds, and millers all watched. At the foot of the gallows, time stretched, final words were offered. A confession, sometimes written, sometimes spoken aloud with a trembling voice. A prayer, a glance to the sky. The hush before the moment, then silence. It was not a chaotic scene. There was no chanting, no mockery. Just the wind, the creak of wood, and the long exhale of a community reminded of its boundaries. In some places, the body was left for a time days, even weeks meant not to shock, but to warn. The sight of its standing sentinel at the edge of the road served as a wordless decree. Justice lives here, but even this was done with a kind of ritualized care. In England, the gallows field was sometimes tended like a garden cleared of overgrowth, marked with a low fence. In parts of France, the area might be blessed or salted by the local priest. It was not revenge, it was order. And for the condemned, while the moment was final, it was also framed with structure. The ability to confess, to receive the last rites, to be buried even if beyond the churchyard walls offered a kind of closing, however stark. As you imagine the quiet field returning to its stillness, the people drifting back down the hill to their homes and hearths, the scaffold standing empty once more, you may begin to sense the rhythm behind it all. A cadence of justice, neither frenzied nor cruel, but methodical. And from this place of endings, we now step back into life, into the marketplaces and crooked alleys, where justice did not always come with ceremony, but in more unexpected, intimate, and sometimes curious forms. In the winding alleys and stone-paved streets of medieval towns, where the scent of yeast and ash drifted with the morning fog, one figure was as vital to daily life as the parish priest or the town crier, the baker. Bread was more than sustenance. It was expectation. It was daily routine. And it was tightly regulated. Authorities knew this well. So laws regarding bread were detailed and numerous. The weight must be correct, the price fair, and the flour pure. To fail in these matters was not simply a private error. It was a breach of public trust. And as such, punishment awaited. One curious form of justice reserved for dishonest bakers was as theatrical as it was memorable. Picture, if you will, a modest town square just past dawn. A young baker, his apron still dusted with flour, is led forward by two watchmen. In his hands, he carries a loaf of bread, deemed underweight by the local inspector. He is not stolen. He is not struck. He is baked short. The punishment is peculiar. Rather than a fine or whipping, he is placed into a wooden cart, nothing elegant, just planks and wheels, the kind used for refuse. He is seated upon a platform of stale loaves and crusts. Around his neck, a sign, a dishonest measure. Then, slowly, the cart begins its circuit through the market streets. People watch, they do not jeer, but they understand. The baker's era has disrupted something sacred, the daily flow of fair bread, and the ritual of public correction reaffirms their place in the system. That justice is not reserved for murderers or thieves, it applies to breakfast, too. In some towns, this punishment had a name, the bread drag. In others, it was left informal, a one-time performance arranged by the Reeve or Beadle. Either way, it was rarely repeated by the same offender, and it wasn't limited to bakers. Butchers, too, faced similar fates. A short weight of pork, an improperly cured side of meat, and soon a ride through town with a pig's head dangling from a stick or a spoiled cut tied around the neck. These were not brutal punishments. They were not designed to wound, but they were profoundly memorable, both to those who endured them and those who watched. The message was simple: honesty is part of daily bread, and should that honesty falter, the town will notice. Even today, laws regarding bread linger in some European codes, ghosts of a time when the weight of a loaf could stir the hand of justice, and as the baker steps down from the cart and removes his sign, the streets slowly resume their rhythm. Baskets are filled, coins exchanged. The scent of bread, fresh, honest, and warm, drifts once again through the air. From this world of petty enforcement and edible justice, we turn next to an individual whose life crossed paths with far weightier consequence. A man whose fate was decided not by ounces or flour, but by the stirrings of fear, authority, and an empire's delicate balance. Among the narrow lanes and stone chapels of 12th century London, there emerged a figure both admired and feared, remembered in hushed chronicles and civic records: William Fitz Osbert. He was not a king, not a knight, he held no great office. But for a short, burning moment, he became the voice of London's poor, and for that, he paid dearly. William was born into privilege, educated in the cathedral schools, and trained in law. He knew Latin, knew the workings of court, and could navigate the streets of both the city and the cloister. Yet unlike many of his rank, he did not withdraw behind fine doors or settle into easy authority. Instead, he walked among the poor. In the final years of the 1100s, discontent simmered beneath the surface of London life. The gap between the wealthy merchant class and the labourers who hauled their goods grew starker. Tithes pressed harder, rent crept higher, and justice, when it came, rarely touched the well-appointed. Into this space stepped William. He spoke to crowds in marketplaces and parish courtyards, calling for relief, for fairness, for recognition. His words, measured, articulate, and passionate, stirred something rarely awakened: organized dissent. For many, he was a hero; for others, a danger. Records suggest he gathered hundreds to his cause, some say thousands. He was called the poor man's advocate, the people's orator. And though no blades were drawn, and no riot declared, the murmurs of unrest reached the ears of those in power. The crown responded swiftly. The Archbishop of Canterbury ordered his arrest. But William, aware of the danger, fled to the church of St. Mary le Bow, claiming sanctuary under the ancient rites of holy ground. For 3 days he remained. Then, in an unusual breach of custom, armed men stormed the church. William was seized, dragged from the altar, and taken to the Tower. His trial was swift, his sentence final. He was condemned to death for inciting rebellion, not for violence, but for words, for gathering, for daring to name the iniquity that others endured in silence. He was taken to Tyburn Hill, then still a field, rough and grassy, and hanged. His body, it is said, was burned after, to prevent any relic from becoming a symbol of resistance. But symbols, as history often proves, do not require relics. Even after his death, William's name lingered in whispers. The church where he was taken still bore the marks of that breach. And 4 years after, those who questioned the fairness of law remembered the man who once stood among them and spoke. William Fitz Osbert's punishment was not only the end of a man, but the silencing of a voice. And yet, in that silencing, A faint echo remained threaded into the cobbles, carried in parish tales, and carved faintly into the memory of the city. From this act of silent defiance, we drift now into a quieter form of punishment, not of gallows or chains, but of belief and superstition, of marks unseen, and of rituals that sought to heal by casting out. Not all punishments in the medieval world were measured in chains or cuts. Some were carried out in whispers, incense, and prayer in rooms dimly lit by candles, behind stone walls that echoed not with cries, but with the low cadence of Latin rites. This was the realm of the spiritual offense, for sin did not always manifest in theft or violence. Sometimes it emerged through strange behaviors, sudden illnesses, or voices that spoke through unfamiliar tongues. And when reason failed, and medicine stood mute, the church stepped forward not with stocks or rope, but with exorcism. The belief in possession was not limited to demons. Spirits, tempters, even echoes of ancestral sin were thought to lodge themselves within the body. And when someone, a girl of 13, a labourer from the fields, a nun cloistered 4 decades, began to speak strangely or fall into unresponsive trances, punishment took on a different shape. Imagine a cold chapel at the edge of a village. The floor swept clean, a single crucifix above the altar. A priest, flanked by 2 assistants, begins the rite. The afflicted lies on a pallet of straw, eyes closed, breathing uneven. There are no crowds, no punishment to see, but the ritual itself is one of control. The priest speaks not to the person, but to the thing within them. Depart, unclean spirit. Incense rises, psalms are read. Holy water flicks against the stone floor. The goal is not to shame, nor to injure, but to restore. And yet, in its own way, this too is punishment. The afflicted endures long hours of chants, of sleepless nights, of ritual fasting. The family is watched carefully. Questions are asked about behaviors, dreams, past confessions. The boundary between spiritual healing and social correction blurs. Was the possession real? Was it madness? Was it sorrow? Deeply hidden. For the church, the answer mattered less than the outcome. To re-establish order. In monasteries, cases were sometimes recorded in detail, not for study, but for future guidance. A monk's trembling hand might note the time of night when the afflicted cried out, or the verse that caused a sudden silence. These exorcisms rarely ended in dramatic release. More often, they faded like mist at dawn. The afflicted simply grew still, the rites ceased, and the chapel returned to its silence. Yet the memory lingered, not always in fear, but in reverence. And the punished, if we may call them that, returned to life. Sometimes restored, sometimes changed, often watched. It was a form of justice shaped by belief, where sin was not punished through pain, but through cleansing, not exile, but redemption. And from this world of incense and breath, of unseen forces and whispered prayers, we return to the realm of those whose punishments were decided not by faith, nor by court, but by their mastery of ink, books, and the quiet leverage of education. In the heavy silence of cathedral cloisters, beneath archways worn smooth by the sawless of centuries, lived a class of men who held not swords, nor land, but words. The clergy, their lives were marked by ritual, learning, and silence. And in the complex web of medieval law, they occupied a curious position, neither entirely above punishment, nor fully subject to the secular hand of justice. This peculiar space was defined by a privilege known as the benefit of clergy, originating in the early Middle Ages. The benefit was a legal right granted to ordained clergy that allowed them to be tried in ecclesiastical courts rather than royal ones. And for much of the period, these church courts imposed lighter, more spiritual punishments: penance, fasting, confinement to a monastery rather than public flogging or execution. In theory, the privilege applied only to those ordained. But as time passed, a loophole emerged, one that changed the shape of justice for many. If a man could read specifically, if he could recite the opening verse of Psalm 51 in Latin, Known as the neck verse, he might claim the benefit of clergy. The verse began, Miserere mei, Deus, secundum misericordiam tuum, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. This single verse became a lifeline. Imagine a courtroom in a bustling English town. A man stands accused of theft, his second offence. The sentence, in ordinary terms, would be hanging. But the judge, aware of the claim, opens a small, leather-bound psalter. The accused steps forward. His voice shakes, but the words come halting, but correct. He's spared. It is not absolution. He may still face branding or confinement. But the rope is lifted, the gallows forgotten. Over time, even those who weren't true clergy memorized the verse in secret, hoping never to need it. Some courts allowed it only once a first benefit. If tried again, the option vanished. The result was a subtle hierarchy, not just of birth or wealth, but of literacy. To know Latin, to speak the words of David, was to shield oneself from the harsher edge of the law. Critics emerged, of course. Some saw the loophole as corruption, others saw it as mercy. Either way, the benefit endured for centuries, only gradually restricted in the modern age. It reminds us that punishment in the medieval world was not only about acts, but about status. Not just what one had done, but who one was, or what one could recite. And so the psalm became more than prayer. It became armor. As we gently close the book and leave the quiet of the court, we return once again to the marketplace stew, the lives of the many who never held psalters or stood beneath vaulted ceilings, and for whom justice was felt not in verses, but in rope, stone, and voice. The marketplace, even in the smallest of towns, was more than a place to trade. It was a stage, a hub, a mouthpiece for the rhythms of communal life. And at the center of that flow stood a figure whose voice shaped the public's awareness of law, decree, and consequence, the town crier. Dressed in colors that varied by region, sometimes a sash of blue, sometimes a tabard marked with a crest. The crier was not flamboyant, but easily noticed. He carried a staff or bell, a symbol of authority, and his voice was practiced in the art of clarity and control. Before written posters and public boards became common, it was the crier who announced the sentences of the court. Imagine a Wednesday morning. A faint mist still clings to the thatched eaves. The market is just beginning to stir, traders unpacking baskets, farmers haggling over turnips, a child sweeping straw near the bakehouse. A bell rings. The town quiets, not in fear, but in practiced expectation. The crier lifts a parchment. His tone is solemn, measured, and a little theatrical. Let it be known to all present. On the feast of St. Matthew, one John of Boughton was found guilty of unlawful entry, and will be placed in the stocks from first light till sundown. 2 days hence, there is no uproar. Just a few nods, a murmur, perhaps a knowing glance. The punishment itself may be mild, but the announcement ensures it is shared, known, remembered. This public declaration was part of the punishment. It removed anonymity. It turned a private act into communal knowledge. And in many cases, it prevented the need for further penalty. Exposure alone was sometimes enough. The crier's role extended beyond criminal sentences. He announced price regulations, curfew changes, and even lost property. But nothing stirred more silent attention than a public naming. In some regions, the crier walked a fixed route, stopping at designated points near the church, the well, the hall. In others, he remained on a central platform and allowed his voice to carry outward. He was not a judge, but he bore the voice of judgment. The weight of the crier's words endured, not through their harshness, but their permanence. A sentence spoken aloud became part of memory, woven into the marketplace air, carried down alleys and through homes, and for those who stood nearby, listening whether to learn or merely observe, it was a reminder that no act passed entirely unseen, that justice moved not only through rods and ropes, but through voice. From this world of public declaration, we shift next into a more private space, one where justice was carved not with words, but with tools. etched into flesh, marked in ways that could not be forgotten, even in silence. Among the many methods used to impose consequence in the medieval world, few were as permanent or as quietly devastating as branding. It was not as common as the stocks, nor as dramatic as the gallows, but branding left its own unmistakable signature, a mark borne not for days or weeks, but for a lifetime. A silent companion, burned into flesh, visible even when clothes were drawn tight and mouths remained closed. This punishment was typically reserved for repeat offenders, those who had already stood in the square, already paid the fine, already faced the whip, and yet returned again to stand before the bench. The court might decree, "Let him be branded with the mark of theft." The sentence was swift in delivery, but unyielding in consequence. Imagine a small chamber, stone-walled and sparsely lit. The air smells of iron and old wood. A brazier glows near the wall, and within it rests the branding iron often shaped in a single letter, T for thief, V for vagabond, or in some places, a stylized cross or fleur-de-lis. The skin, often that of the hand, the cheek, or in later periods, the shoulder, is exposed. The hot iron is pressed. There is no spectacle, no crowd. Only the sizzle, the restraint, and the soft prayer of a clerk noting the moment in his book. Then the mark remains. It is not meant to destroy. It is meant to identify, and in the world beyond that chamber, it speaks constantly. Employers glance and turn away. Merchants count coin twice when such a hand reaches forward. Strangers squint at a face, trying to place what the symbol means. Some try to cover it bandages, ash, soot. Others simply live with it. Not defiant, not resigned, just quietly altered. In some towns, branding also served as a substitute for execution. A judge might, in an act of clemency, spare a man the noose, but insist that the world remember him all the same. This balance between mercy and memory was delicate, and branding, in its own way, was a sentence carried forward not by guards or ropes, but by eyes. By the glances that lingered, the conversations that paused, the opportunities that vanished. It served as a boundary, a threshold. Once crossed, return to anonymity was rare, and yet, among the branded, life did continue. Some found trades where the mark mattered less: fishing, tanning, mining. Others fled to cities where crowds diluted recognition. A few even rose again in local esteem, their past absorbed by time, their mark fading into mere curiosity. Branding did not kill, but it changed. And from this world of hot metal and flesh, we move next to another realm where punishment left no physical trace, but echoed in the mind, the heart, and the careful navigation of one's community standing. Some punishments leave no visible scar, no record in parchment, no rope on the gallows, no iron pressed to skin. And yet, they linger longest etched not in flesh, but in human connection. Shunning, or social exile, was one of the most potent and least tangible forms of punishment in the medieval world. It required no tools, no proclamations, only agreement and silence. Though not always codified in legal texts, the practice was deeply embedded in village culture, particularly in tight-knit communities where survival depended on cooperation and reputation. Imagine a small hamlet of no more than 40 souls. Stone cottages ringed by winter gardens, smoke rising from low chimneys. Every task is communal: fetching water, mending fences, sharing grain during lean months. And within this delicate web, someone breaks trust. Perhaps it is a lie that endangered another, a refusal to contribute to a collective effort, a pattern of insults or withheld aid, not always criminal, but deeply disruptive. There is no court, no stocks. Instead, something quieter begins. A woman who once shared bread now offers none. A neighbor who once waved now turns away. The blacksmith, who always fixed tools without charge, suddenly demands coin. The parish bench remains just slightly too crowded. The shunning is not declared, it is felt. Days stretch into weeks. The air thickens not with anger, but absence. No children come near, no greetings are exchanged. To live through this was to be both seen and unseen, present yet denied. And in a world where isolation meant vulnerability, where illness, injury, or even loneliness could wear a person down, this punishment held power. It wasn't always permanent. Often, a gesture of contrition was enough to begin the slow return. A shared candle at Mass, a quiet offering to the poor box, an apology, spoken not loudly, but plainly. Sometimes, priests intervened offering mediation, reminding the parish of mercy. Other times, the silence endured, and those shunned drifted away to other towns, leaving no trail behind. This form of punishment reminds us that justice was not always wielded from above. It could rise from the ground, woven through daily interaction, enforced by nothing but withheld kindness. Shunning lacked spectacle, but it shaped lives. And now, as we gently step back from the hush of social exile, we return to the upper chambers and broader halls where those of influence and learning found themselves, on rare occasions, subject to judgment as well. But their trials, as you'll see, unfolded with different tones and textures. In the university towns of medieval Europe, Oxford, Bologna, Paris, where scholars in long robes shuffled across cobbled lanes and candles flickered above ink-stained desks, justice moved to a rhythm all its own. These were places of learning, yes, but also of privilege, tension, and the occasional uproar. And when disputes arose between student and townsperson, or within the university itself, punishment took a curious, measured form. Imagine the cloisters of a great university in the 14th century. Stone corridors echoing with the scrape of shoes and the low murmur of recitation. In one corner, a student argues with a tavern keeper over a spilled pitcher. Voices rise, a blow is exchanged, a shop shutter is broken in the scuffle. In any ordinary town, the consequence might be swift, a night in the stocks, a fine, or even a lashing. But here, the offender is a scholar, a member of the universitas, a body protected by charters and, in many places, by papal decree. To lay hands on him is to risk friction with the church itself. So, justice falls instead to the Chancellor's Court. These internal tribunals operated with a blend of academic formality and ecclesiastical oversight. The accused was summoned sometimes with a written notice, sometimes by bell, and asked to appear in a hall furnished with benches, a pulpit, and stern-faced clerks. There was no jury, only deliberation. Witnesses might be called. Fellow scholars offered character testimony. The rules emphasized decorum, reflection, and precedent. And when punishment was given, it was rarely physical. A student might be suspended from lectures, prohibited from leaving his lodging after dark, assigned additional study under the guidance of a senior master, or, in more serious cases, expelled from the university walls altogether, a fate not unlike exile. For faculty, the stakes were subtler. A misused position of authority could lead to censure, transfer to another institution, or pressure from bishops or donors to step down. These were not loud judgments. They unfolded behind closed doors, with ink and wax seals, but they mattered deeply. To lose one's place in a university was to lose livelihood, identity, and station. At times, these internal systems were criticized, accused of shielding wrongdoers, and in some towns, resentment grew between citizens and scholars, particularly when town courts were prevented from acting against students. But in the eyes of the university, this self-governance was not indulgence, it was order. A justice suited not for the sword or the lash, but for the mind. And so, in lecture halls and libraries, in corners filled with dust and parchment, punishment came softly, not unseen, but unshouted, a measured consequence, cloaked in scholarship. As the candle burns low in the scribe's chamber, and the page is turned, we leave these halls behind and return to the streets, where the tools of justice clanged more audibly, and where punishment left its mark not in exile or study, but in cold metal and common fear. Down by the edge of many medieval towns, where the water ran slow and muddied between reeds and warm pilings, there often stood a wooden frame, part scaffold, park contraption, a seat balanced over a shallow body of water, suspended by arms or ropes, tethered to the bank. This was the cucking stool, a punishment for disorderly conduct, especially for what was termed scolding or public quarrelling. It was most often reserved for women, not because men never raised their voices, but because women's words were judged differently, more disruptive, more dangerous, and so more carefully policed. The cucking stool was not a device of violence. Its intent was discomfort, humiliation, and display. Picture a chilly afternoon, a crowd gathered at the edge of the green. A woman, perhaps middle-aged, perhaps young, sits strapped to the stool. Her feet are bare, her cloak hangs damp in the air. The onlookers murmur, some smile faintly. Others avert their gaze. With slow, methodical rhythm, the stool is lowered. It dips beneath the water, just long enough to soak, then rises again. She coughs, blinks, waits, and again, the dip. There is no cruelty in the process, at least, not outwardly. No blows are struck, no wounds are drawn. But the chill seeps in, the public air hums with judgment. And the message is clear: your words carried too far, and now the water will carry you back to silence. In some towns, the punishment was formalized, authorized by local bylaws and church decrees. In others, it was improvised, a tradition handed down more by memory than script. The duration varied. Some endured a few dips, others a dozen. It depended on the magistrate, the offence, and the patience of the onlookers. When released, the punished often walked home soaked and silent. Their place in the community changed, not always permanently, but distinctly. A reminder not only to them, but to all who watched. The cucking stool, in its design and symbolism, reveals much about medieval society, how justice was not always about restoring harm, but enforcing harmony, not only about law, but order. And though the stool itself eventually vanished from practice, the memory of it lingered. In stories passed down, in drawings tucked into the corners of old records, in the faint impression of wooden posts, once set beside village streams. From the water's edge, we now move toward the spires and stone cloisters of the church, not as a refuge, but as an institution that, in its own way, wielded judgment. A realm where spiritual failing met structured penance, and where justice came not in chairs or ropes, but in fasts, confessions, and solemn rituals of return. Within the high stone walls of medieval abbeys and cathedrals, where sunlight filtered dimly through coloured glass and the air was thick with incense and stillness, punishment took on an altogether different form, introspective, measured, and deeply spiritual. This was the realm of penance. For the medieval church, sin was not merely a spiritual failing, it had weight, consequence, and form. And while secular courts might address theft, violence, or deceit with rope and rod, the church sought instead to heal the soul through structured reconciliation. Imagine a monk approaching the confessional, head bowed, sandals brushing the cold stone. He confesses envy, or pride, or perhaps a moment of harshness toward a fellow brother. The priest listens, and then quietly assigns penance. That penance might take many shapes: fasting for a week on bread and water, reciting psalms at midnight, walking barefoot in pilgrimage to a nearby shrine, giving alms, sitting in silence during communal meals. These were not punishments in the legal sense. There was no shame inflicted, no public rebuke. But they were taken seriously, and their effects were felt. For lay people as well, confession followed by penance was routine. A woman who bore false witness might be instructed to stand outside the church doors for 3 Sundays, dressed plainly, holding a candle, in quiet reflection. A man who neglected his family might be barred from the Eucharist until he made restitution. In more severe cases, especially for those in positions of spiritual authority, penance could mean removal from office, isolation in a distant priory, or years of silent labor under the eyes of fellow monks. And for sins not confessed voluntarily but revealed through scandal or inquiry, the church acted formally. Ecclesiastical courts met in quiet halls, heard testimony, and prescribed elaborate rituals of atonement. But even these, though solemn, were aimed at healing rather than punishment. In rare and extreme cases, when sins were considered heretical or dangerously disruptive, the Church turned to more severe action: public recantation, penitent's garb, or, in the gravest moments, handing the accused to secular authorities. Yet for the vast majority of believers, penance remained personal, humble, and quietly transformative. It was a way of reweaving the threads of a torn conscience, of acknowledging fault without spectacle, of restoring not just the soul, but one standing within the tightly knit community of faith. And so, within the cold stillness of stone chapels, beside altars worn smooth by centuries of touch, punishment found its gentlest form, not as pain, but as pause, a moment to reflect, repair, and begin again. From these quiet cloisters of spiritual reckoning, we now descend once more into the everyday streets where carts rumbled, voices rose, and punishment re-emerged not in ritual, but in raw necessity, enforced by those whose hands kept the town's order intact. As the sun dipped behind rooftops and the candles in windows began to flicker low, a different kind of rhythm took hold in the medieval town. Streets narrowed in the shadows, footsteps echoed. The chatter of the market gave way to the rustle of rats, the creak of signs, the distant bark of a dog. And into this soft unease stepped the town's watchman, often overlooked in tales of law and punishment. These figures were the guardians of the night, tasked with maintaining order when most souls had retreated behind bolted doors. They were not constables in shining armor, nor soldiers trained in battle. They were often older men, or townsfolk rotating through duty, armed with lanterns, staves, and sharp ears. Their primary role was not arrest, but observation. Imagine a group of three, moving quietly along the muddy lane. One carries a horn, another a short cudgel, the third a rusty bell. They pass the smithy, the granary, the alehouse now shuttered tight. At intervals, they pause and listen. Any outcry, disturbance, or suspicious movement might be cause for investigation. They were empowered to detain, to report, and sometimes to deliver swift penalties, particularly for curfew violators, drunken brawlers, or those found loitering without reason. Their authority was practical, immediate, and largely respected. A man stumbling home, well, the dark, might be halted. If sober and known, he might be gently warned. If belligerent, or found in another man's alley, he might be marched to the holding cell near the Rievaulx. No trial yet, only a night's confinement and questioning at dawn. The watchman also played a role in enforcing moral order. Lovers meeting in secret, apprentices sneaking away from their beds, pilgrims overstaying their welcome all might receive a visit or a word from the watch. And their presence was not merely punitive. In times of fire, flood, or sudden illness, it was the watch that raised alarm. They were the town's eyes in darkness. Yet their power came not from weaponry or strength, but from ritual and routine. Their slow, deliberate pace, the knowledge that someone was always moving, always listening. Justice at night was not loud. It did not burn. It whispered. The punishments meted out under the watch's eye were often temporary detention, warning, report. But the fear of being seen, of being marked by the men who kept vigil, was often enough. And so, as the moonlight spills across cobblestones and the watchmen complete another silent round, the town returns to rest. Soon, the bells will ring again, doors will open, markets will stir, and justice, once more, will walk by daylight. But for now, beneath the stars and through the cold mist, it belongs to those who walk slow, speak little, and carry the weight of order on quiet shoulders. From this world of soft-footed vigilance, we now journey toward the story of one punished not with flame or rope, but by the long erosion of honor, and a sentence that unfolded not in moments, but across an entire life. Among the rolling hills of northern England, not far from the ruins of what was once Rievaulx Abbey, there lived in the late 13th century a woman known in scattered records only as Eleanor. She was not noble, though her family had land. She was not cloistered, though she lived much of her life in proximity to the abbey walls. Her name appears in one court record, then disappears for decades only to re-emerge later, tied to a curious form of punishment, sanctioned withdrawal. Eleanor's transgression, as best the records suggest, was one of defiance. She challenged the authority of a local landholder, possibly over inheritance, possibly over boundaries. She refused to comply with a ruling delivered by a local ecclesiastical court. Not violently, not with rebellion, but with stillness. She did not pay, she did not bend. The church responded not with excommunication, but with a quieter judgment. She was declared contumacious, willfully resistant, and thus not to be spoken to, not to be served at market, not to be aided in public tasks. No violence, no stocks, just absence. She was not shunned in the folk sense, nor exiled from the land. But her punishment resembled both. Her petitions were ignored. Her voice, when raised in public, was answered with turned backs. Clergy would not hear her confession. Her name was left out of feast lists. She remained among the living, but outside the rhythm of life. It lasted years. There is no record of a formal lifting, no dramatic moment of reconciliation. Only that, sometime later, she is listed again modestly, among donors to a small hospital. No fanfare, just reappearance. What she did in that long interim is unknown. Whether she softened, whether others relented, whether the punishment simply faded with time and memory. But hers is a story of a punishment not imposed by tools, nor enforced by guards, but by consensus. And the loneliness of it, the slow erosion of connection, was no less real than any mark of iron or blade. In Eleanor's story, we glimpse a form of justice that mirrored medieval understandings of community, that to be part of the world was privilege, and that removal, however bloodless, could still wound. From this quiet unraveling of status, we now turn toward a different sort of punishment, one that bore pageantry and spectacle, not erasure, where silence was replaced with music, costume, an ironic drama, and where the judgment came not only from the law, but from the laughing mouths of neighbors. Long before public punishment was centralized in courts and codices, there existed another, older method of correcting behavior, one that drew not on judges or priests, but on neighbors and noise. A ritual both festive and punitive, chaotic yet strangely controlled. It was called the charivari. In essence, it was a community's loud, mocking disapproval expressed through performance, costume, and the rattling clatter of everyday items turned into instruments of judgment. Imagine a quiet evening in a rural village. Hearts are burning low, chickens have settled. Then, slowly at first, comes a strange noise, a pot struck with a wooden spoon. A whistle, laughter. Soon, the sounds multiply. A procession forms, neighbors, masked or painted, carrying bells, kettles, horns. They move through the streets with no fixed rhythm. They stop at one house. Perhaps the man inside has remarried too soon after a widowhood. Perhaps a woman was overheard berating her husband in public. Perhaps a pair was known to quarrel so loudly that even the livestock became agitated. The charivari was not about legal crime. It was about transgression of social expectation, about harmony disrupted. At the chosen house, the crowd begins their ritual. They shout rhymes, chant, rattle their tools, imitate voices. Some carry effigies, exaggerated and crude, parodying the couple or the accused. There is no violence, but the meaning is clear. Sometimes the ritual ends with laughter and dispersal. Other times, it continues for days, returning each evening until apology is offered, or the mocked individuals participate in the ritual themselves, symbolically accepting their correction. In parts of France, the tradition was known as charivari. In England, it was sometimes called rough music. In Germany, it had other names, but the structure remained similar. Noise, jest, performance, and pressure. Though informal, this form of punishment held real power. It could affect reputations, prompt genuine behavior change, even provoke legal disputes in its own right. The charivari was not authorized by courts, but rarely opposed by them. It functioned as a kind of folk justice, more playful than cruel, more embarrassing than brutal, but still deeply influential. And for those subject to it, the memory lingered. To have your name made into rhyme, to see your likeness paraded in effigy, to hear the clang of pots echo through night after night. Punishment did not always need pain. Sometimes, the chorus of neighbors, dressed in jest and wielding kitchen tools, could leave the deepest impression. As the echoes of mockery fade into the dark and the procession turns back toward its homes, we now shift again toward a place where punishment was defined not by noise, but by paperwork, not by laughter, but by law, a space where every mark mattered, and every sentence was written into the fabric of a life. In the hushed chambers of medieval administration, deep within town halls, manorial courts, and chancery offices, there existed a different kind of punishment, one that did not bruise the skin, shame in public, or call forth the clang of bells. Instead, it lived in ink, the written record. The medieval world, contrary to some modern assumptions, was far from illiterate in its institutions. Court scribes kept detailed logs. Manorial rolls noted every fine, every dispute, every verdict. These documents were stored carefully, tied in bundles, and brought out for future reference when judgment loomed again. To be recorded as a wrongdoer was to carry a shadow that followed wherever your name was known. Imagine a man named Godric of Thatchcombe, a miller by trade. In 1297, he's fined for selling underweight flour. In 1300, he's again cited, this time for obstructing the waterway that powers another's mill. The Reeve, flipping through past entries, notes the earlier mark, and this time, the sentence is harsher. The act of being recorded, of having one's name written by a clerk's hand in a ledger that might outlive generations, was a form of quiet, bureaucratic punishment. It followed you invisibly. It informed how future accusations would be judged. It shaped how your neighbor spoke of you, even as the latest charge was minor. In towns with centralized courts, the rolls became comprehensive. Known troublemakers appeared often. Marginally, a brief note scrawled by clerks sometimes offered opinions, recalcitrant, unrepentant, or chronic. These notes weren't always fair. Sometimes they were based on rumor or assumption, but they mattered. When you applied to join a guild, to take up a lease, to be married with church sanction, someone might consult those rolls, and the record of wrongdoing, even long past, could interfere. There were even cases where men attempted to pay for expungement bribes, favors, appeals to a sympathetic clerk. A few succeeded, most did not. For the majority of medieval people, these records were never seen directly, but they were felt, like a hand resting just behind the shoulder. The rolls had a long memory. Punishment through writing did not leave a scar. It left a trail, and so we remember that justice was not always theatrical. Sometimes, it was a quiet mark in brown ink, folded in a ledger, stored in a chest, and opened years later at the sound of your name. From the silence of the record hall, we now walk toward the outer edges of towns and the low stone buildings that housed yet another layer of punishment, the jail. A place of confinement, but not always of guilt, a place where time, not trial, was the cost most dearly paid. In the medieval world, the jail, or jail, as it would come to be known, was not the end of justice. It was the pause, a space between accusation and decision, a holding place for the uncertain, the unresolved, the yet to be tried. Unlike modern prisons, which serve as places of long-term sentence, medieval jails were most often temporary lodgings, grim, spare, and poorly kept, where the primary punishment was waiting. Imagine a low stone building at the edge of a town's boundary. No spires, no gates, just a thick wooden door banded in iron. Inside, the air is heavy with damp. The walls sweat in winter, the floor is beaten earth, or stone slick with moss. There are no separate cells, just one shared chamber, dim and cramped. Those inside are not all guilty. Some are thieves, some debtors. Others have been accused, but not yet tried. Still others await transport to a manor court far away. The jailer, a man of modest means and few illusions, guards the door. He might also sell food to the prisoners, for jails rarely provided it. Without coin or outside help, a prisoner might go hungry 4 days. There are no beds, only straw, often wet. Light filters in through narrow slits, too high to see through. The sounds of the town outside are muffled carts, horses, bells, but unreachable. Jail time is indistinct. Some prisoners remain only a night or 2, others months. A few years awaiting trials delayed by politics, war, or neglect. The punishment is not just confinement, it is uncertainty, a kind of limbo. In England, the assize courts, travelling bodies of royal justice, might take a year or more to reach a region. Until then, those accused of even petty crimes might sit in the jail, untried, unpaid, and often forgotten. Jail conditions varied. In cities, they could be marginally better attached to guild halls or castle keeps. In rural areas, they were little more than sheds, reinforced by chains and watchmen. Corruption was common. Jailers might extract bribes for small favours: extra straw, better food, a word delivered to a magistrate. Those with friends outside fared better, those without faded. And yet, even here, community found its way in. Chaplains occasionally visited. Fellow prisoners shared songs, stories, whispered prayers. Some turned to carving initials etched into stone. Others kept small diaries, scratched into wood or bone. The jail, despite its squalor, became a place where the mind wandered through fear, through memory, through hope. Punishment here was not enacted with violence. It was administered slowly, through the eroding passage of time, through absence from the world, through the hunger for conclusion. As the door creaks closed behind another day's turning, we step outside once more into fresher air, where justice is decided not in darkness, but beneath the open sky, on hills and commons, in view of all. Our next step is toward a tradition older still, the ordeal. A test of truth, not by reason or evidence, but by fire, water, and fate. Before the ink of laws had settled into permanence, before juries deliberated behind wooden benches, justice was often sought in more ancient forms, in the hand of nature, the will of God, and the silence of the elements. This was the ordeal. Neither entirely punishment nor pure trial. Ordeals were rituals meant to reveal guilt or innocence through physical tests. Their logic rested on a simple belief that God would protect the innocent, that divine will would show itself through fire, water, or pain. There were many types. The ordeal of hot iron. A glowing bar was lifted from the fire and carried a fixed number of paces by the accused bare-handed, usually. The hand was then wrapped and sealed. After 3 days, the priest unwrapped it. If the wound festered, guilt was assumed. If it healed cleanly, the person was declared innocent. The ordeal of water. The accused was bound and lowered into a pool or river. If they floated, they were considered guilty, repelled by the purity of water. If they sank, innocence was presumed, and they were quickly hauled out. The ordeal of boiling water. The accused reached into a cauldron to retrieve a stone. The severity of the burn and the healing was judged by clerics. These were not casual customs. They were carefully choreographed rituals, often performed by clergy in front of communities, with prayer, Latin chants, and solemn observation. Imagine a small parish clearing on a crisp spring morning. Villagers gather. A priest blesses the iron. The air smells of earth and wood smoke. A man steps forward, nervous, quiet, his face unreadable. The iron glows orange in the brazier. A bell tolls. This is not spectacle in the way of stocks or pillories. It is sacred, or, at least, it was believed to be. The ordeal was not meant to humiliate. It was meant to decide. And for many, it did. But over time, the Church began to distance itself from these rites. By the 13th century, the Fourth Lateran Council officially condemned ordeals involving pain or injury, encouraging instead confession and rational inquiry. Some persisted in rural areas long after, quietly, without sanction, with belief that lingered longer than authority. Ordeals remind us of a time when truth was seen not as a product of debate, but as something that could be summoned, touched, measured by burn or breath or buoyancy. They also remind us how fragile justice could be, how deeply entwined it was with fear, hope, and divine mystery. And now, as the coals die down and the crowd disperses beneath the soft grey sky, we leave this ancient ritual behind. Our next path leads to the world of elite institutions once more, where the cloisters and gates of monasteries held their own codes of discipline, and where even silence could be enforced with subtle precision. Within the cloistered walls of medieval monasteries, far from the bustling markets and clang of town bells, a different kind of justice quietly unfolded. The world of the monk was not without rules. In fact, it was governed by some of the strictest codes of all, etched not into law books or town scrolls, but into the regular. The rule of St. Benedict, for instance, outlined not just worship and labour, but the proper way to eat, to speak, and to atone. In this world, punishment did not shout, it withdrew. Imagine a Benedictine abbey, tucked in the misted hills of the north, stone halls covered in ivy, a refectory echoing with the scrape of spoons and the occasional murmur of prayer, the monk's violin, robes brushing flagstone. One of them, Brother Aldrich, takes his seat last. His head is lowered. There is no food at his place. This is his punishment. Perhaps he was late for matins, or spoke out of turn, or failed to rise at the bell's first toll. The offence needn't be great. The punishment needn't be severe. For today, his meal is bread and water. No cheese, no stew, no honeyed oat, just the simple fare of correction. For others, the penalty might be silence. A day, a week, even longer, to speak only when required, to communicate through nods or glances. This was not meant to wound, it was meant to redirect, to turn thought inward, to transform discipline into meditation. In more serious cases, monks might be separated from their brethren, assigned solitary labour in the gardens, or given a cell apart from the dormitory. Not imprisoned, not shamed, just set aside, removed from the rhythm they knew. In rare moments, a monk might be stripped of his rank, forced to stand at the door of the chapel barefoot, head bowed, asking forgiveness from each brother who passed. But even in these moments, there was no cruelty, no rod, only structure, repetition, reflection. The abbey's justice was rooted in reform, not retribution. A monk's purpose was the pursuit of spiritual perfection, and discipline was seen not as punishment, but as a stepping stone along that path. And yet, even without pain, these penalties left their mark. The hunger of exclusion, the ache of isolation, the weight of self. Records from monastic scribes speak gently of such episodes, phrases like a period of correction or a time apart. They were not erased from the scrolls of history. They were noted with care as part of the life, as part of the soul's journey. And so, behind those high stone walls, with their echoing chants and simple meals, we glimpse a kind of justice that required no public square, only discipline and belief. From the cloister's hush, we return now to the village edge, where sounds rise once again, and where another form of punishment, loud and theatrical, was used to correct not crimes, but customs. Not all medieval punishments were imposed by court or clergy. Some rose from the people themselves, from a deeply rooted sense of social order, of how things ought to be. When that unspoken code was broken, particularly in marriage or domestic life, justice sometimes arrived not with judgment, but with spectacle. This was the Skimmington ride, also known in parts of England and Europe, riding the stag. The Skimmington was a kind of public shaming, part parade, part mockery, used to correct behaviour considered inverted or unnatural, particularly when a man was seen as weak or dominated by his wife, or when a couple's behaviour challenged gender expectations. It was not about crime, but about control, a social pressure valve, a signal that something had stepped outside the norm. Imagine a rural village in Somerset. Fields stretch beyond sight, cottages lean into the wind, A dispute has become too loud, too frequent. A man known for his silence indoors and visible bruises begins to draw murmurs. Or perhaps it is a woman who scolds openly in the market, or a man seen doing too much of what is thought to be a wife's work. A plan begins. A group gathers neighbors, sometimes masked. They build an effigy, straw limbs, a wooden face, dressed to mock the man or the couple. Or, in some versions, a real person is placed in a cart, unwilling or paid to participate. Then the procession begins. They rattle pans, beat pots, play fiddles off-key. They sing rude rhymes, nonsense, satire, exaggeration. Some carry ladles or wooden spoons, symbols of the home turned outward, theatrical. They march through the village, stopping at doorways, calling out the names of those they ridicule. There is laughter, yes, but also fear. The Skimmington, for all its mockery, held power. To be its target was to become a symbol, to be corrected not by decree, but by noise. The ride might last a night, or return again. Some targets apologized, some fled. Some confronted the mockers, but most simply endured. In the records, Skimmingtons are described with a mixture of tones, sometimes light-hearted, sometimes harsh. Magistrates occasionally condemned them, but more often let them proceed, quietly pleased at how communities kept their own order. And behind the performance lay a truth, that not all punishments were formal. Some were cultural, learned young, performed by many, and remembered for a lifetime. Skimmingtons faded slowly, lingering into early modern times, before vanishing under the weight of new laws and changing customs. But their rhythm of pans and parody still echoes faintly in the corners of history. From this raucous, homemade justice, we now turn back toward the polished halls of royal courts, where the punishments were grander, the crimes more political, and the consequences not of shame, but of silence. When punishment touched the upper ranks of medieval society, lords, ladies, ministers, or knights, it came not with stocks or public flogging, but with silence, ceremony, and slow deliberation. These were lives shielded by blood, wealth, and alliance. And when those shields cracked, justice moved with careful, deliberate steps. Nowhere was this more evident than in royal courts, and nowhere more symbolic than in the walls of the Tower of London. Set along the Thames, the Tower was not simply a fortress. It was a statement, a place of both honor and dread. To be held, there was not merely imprisonment, it was announcement. Imagine a nobleman led across the bridge at twilight. His retinue is gone, his sword surrendered. He is not bound, for it is not necessary. He knows where he goes. Within the walls, he is given chambers bare, but not cruel, a table, a stool, a Bible, perhaps. Servants permitted, but closely watched, the door locks softly behind. He waits. Perhaps he is charged with treason. Perhaps he spoke too plainly in council. Perhaps his land and influence grew too large for the comfort of the king. Whatever the cause, his trial will come. But not tomorrow, sometimes not 4 months. He is questioned, gently, visited by clerks and messengers. Letters are exchanged. Allies whisper at court. And then, finally, a verdict. If guilty, the punishment is seldom ordinary. A noble might be sentenced to death, but not with the common gallows. Instead, a scaffold is erected, sometimes within the tower's grounds, sometimes just outside its walls. Near Tower Hill, the execution is conducted with solemnity. The axe is polished, a cushion laid for prayer. The crowd, though gathered, is quiet. The condemned noble, the loud final words. Often elegant, sometimes defiant, his clothes are well kept. The executioner might kneel before him, asking forgiveness. It is not a spectacle of humiliation, it is a ritual of power. Other times, the sentence is commuted, banishment, a fine, a vow to retreat from politics forever. These punishments are no less serious, just more private. Punishment among the elite was as much about example as justice. It reminded all others, especially those with power, that rank did not grant impunity. It also reminded the common people that their rulers were human, fallible, and occasionally, fallible enough to fall. And when the tower's gates finally closed behind the departing guards, the space was left quiet again. A place where power bent, if only slightly, from the echoing halls of the tower and the whispered trials of nobility. We now return to the countryside to a punishment far less silent, far less elegant. A punishment that walked on wheels, spoke in splinters, and ended only with final breath. In the most severe corners of medieval justice reserved for the vilest crimes, the most public betrayals, or acts deemed truly monstrous, there existed a punishment that stood apart in its cruelty and visibility: the breaking wheel. Also known as the Catherine wheel, later stories. This was no simple device. It was a large cart wheel or iron-bound frame, placed on a scaffold or at a crossroads, and it served not just to kill, but to display, to stretch punishment across both time and space. Its use was most common in parts of Germany and France, and occasionally in other regions of Europe. It was not frequent, but it was unforgettable. The condemned was tied to the wheel, limbs outstretched, body splayed. Sometimes the wheel lay flat, sometimes it stood upright, turning slowly. The executioner, carrying a heavy iron bar or hammer, struck the limbs, breaking them at designated points. There was a method to it, careful, deliberate, systematic, not for sadism, but for spectacle. Sometimes the broken body was woven through the wheel spokes, bound in place, and raised atop a pole to be left exposed to the elements. There, it served as a message, not just to a village, but to all who passed. This was not punishment for theft or petty sin. This was for regicide, treason, murder with aggravating cruelty. It was meant to end not only a life, but a legacy, and yet even here, within such severity, ritual remained. A priest was often present, final prayers were offered. The executioner might be granted forgiveness by the condemned. Some regions allowed family to claim the body after a time. Others decreed that it remain until the last bone fell. Witnesses did not cheer, they watched, some turned away. Others stayed, numb, children were kept back. In time, the breaking wheel became a symbol both feared and mythologized. It appeared in fables, paintings, and even dreams. Saints who had faced it and survived, such as Catherine of Alexandria, were venerated, and as the centuries passed, its use waned. First outlawed in certain provinces, then banned entirely. The last recorded uses faded into early modernity, eventually replaced by more civilized executions, but the wheel left an imprint not just on the earth where it once stood, but in the imagination of all who had seen it. A reminder of justice's most extreme edge. A marker of what society might become when fear overtakes mercy. From this finality, we step gently back, not away from punishment, but toward mystery once again. Toward unearthed clues and strange devices, whose stories have been half lost, half preserved in the quiet hum of archaeological discovery. Centuries after the last sentence was passed, long after the stones of medieval courthouses had crumbled and ivy had overtaken the gay old house roof, the earth began to speak. Archaeologists, digging beneath old market squares, castle courtyards, and long-forgotten parish greens, began to uncover curious objects, silent, corroded, and cold to the touch. These were not coins or brooches. They were tools of punishment, and they carried stories. One such find, a rusted iron collar, simple, circular, hinged, with a locking clasp, found buried beneath the floor of a manor house in East Anglia. Its surface worn smooth, perhaps from skin, perhaps from weather. It had no spikes, no barbs. It wasn't meant to kill, only to restrain. It may have been used on a servant or on a debtor. Perhaps it hung from a post, fastened for hours, reminding both the punished and the passerby of hierarchy and consequence. Elsewhere, fragments of a jougs, kind of iron neck shackle affixed to the outer wall of a church, were discovered embedded in masonry. Parishioners long forgotten once stood there, exposed to the elements, quietly enduring the weight of stone, time, and silence. In a German cellar, wooden masks with distorted features were found, evoking those once used in shame punishments. their expressions grotesque, exaggerated, long tongues, swollen cheeks, glaring eyes. Instruments not of torture, but of symbolism, embarrassment, not injury. Near the foundations of an old town hall, archaeologists uncovered wooden stocks still intact, the grain of the timber hardened by time. The holes where ankles once rested were smooth-edged, as though worn down not by tools, but by the weight of bodies, of waiting. In a buried midden heap discarded, with broken pottery and animal bone, a branding iron was found. The letter T, faint but unmistakable. A relic of a system that believed pain, once burned into flesh, would teach where words could not. None of these discoveries spoke aloud. They bore no inscriptions. But their presence, quietly resting beneath centuries of soil and stone, reconnected us to a world where justice was not only written but lived, carried, endured. And perhaps most haunting of all are the absences, the places where punishment happened, but left no trace. The footsteps now gone, the shouts long since faded. The public square now a quiet garden, with no sign of what once stood at its centre. The soil remembers, not with clarity, not with judgment, but with fragments, bits of iron, bone, and wood enough to remind us that punishment, even when erased from memory, leaves marks. From these buried clues, we return once again to the present, where the world of elites and commoners still separated how punishment was rendered, and where ceremony softened what consequence could not prevent. Not all who faced medieval justice met punishment. Some, standing at the brink of sentence, were pulled back not by innocence, but by favour. Not by law, but by grace. This was the royal pardon, a tool of mercy, a gesture of authority, and, often, a calculated decision made in public view to reinforce the sovereign's power not merely to punish, but to spare. Imagine a packed cathedral nave, the scent of incense thick, the air charged with anticipation. A condemned man stands before the altar, flanked by guards. His sentence, death for theft during time of famine, has been confirmed by local court. But today, a scroll arrives. Its wax seal bears the insignia of the king. Its words, read aloud by a herald, announce that the crown has chosen to forgive. The man's life is spared. The crowd murmurs not in outrage, but in awe. The king's mercy becomes its own kind of justice. Pardons were often issued on feast days or coronations, or in response to petitions sent by family, clergy, or noble allies. They could be partial or full. Some commuted a death sentence to imprisonment. Others allowed the guilty to return home with nothing more than a warning. There were conditions, of course. A man pardoned might be required to leave the kingdom, take holy orders, or serve in military campaigns. Mercy came with threads attached. Sometimes it was transactional. A noble might secure a pardon through favours. A priest might vouch for repentance. A town might request one for political peace. And yet, even with their ties to influence, pardons served an important role. They softened the sharp edge of justice. They reminded the people that kings were not only rulers, but caretakers of the soul of their realm. In some cases, entire groups were pardoned. After revolts or riots, royal emissaries might arrive to read a general amnesty, lifting the weight of guilt from dozens at once. In exchange for loyalty and calm, the act itself was ceremonial. The scroll unrolled, the words spoken clearly. The condemned bowed low. Sometimes they wept. Sometimes they stood in stunned silence. Pardons did not erase the past, but they altered the future. And in doing so, they reinforced the crown's highest claim. Not just the right to command, but the right to forgive. As the cathedral doors swing open and the pardoned man walks free, shoulders hunched, eyes lowered, but alive, we turn our gaze toward those who serve the system from the bottom. The men who held the keys, bore the rods, and never asked questions because their job was not to think, but to punish. In the shadows of every medieval gallows, pillory, or whipping post, there stood a man whose name was often forgotten. Even as his presence loomed large in every town's memory, the executioner. His role was unmistakable and yet paradoxical, feared, necessary, and deeply isolated. Executioners were not chosen for honor. Often, they inherited the role or were consigned to it because of a past offense or an outsider's status. But once appointed, they became fixtures in the machinery of justice, called upon not only for death sentences, but for floggings, brandings, amputations, and even supervision of lesser punishments, like the stocks. They knew their craft well. Imagine a man dressed in dark cloth, not a hood, unless ceremony demanded it, but plain, serviceable clothing. His tools are clean, his hands calloused, steady, his face unreadable. He rises early on days of sentence. He prepares the sight, checks the blade, knots the rope, warms the branding iron, ensures the scaffold is firm. He speaks little. He is not cruel. He is not kind. He is exact. In many towns, the executioner lived apart from others, sometimes just outside the walls. His house might be marked. His children might be avoided. Tradesmen might refuse to touch his coin. Yet he had power, the power to end, and the power, occasionally, to pause. Executioners were sometimes allowed discretion. A swift stroke rather than a slow one, a clean drop, a final whisper of comfort, unrecorded and unshared. They were also skilled in medicine, in anatomy. Some doubled as surgeons. Others were called to inspect wounds, tend to injuries, or more grimly prepare corpses for burial. They were often paid per task. A hanging might earn a fixed sum, a branding, less. A public quartering more than most men earned in a year. Their legacy was complicated. Some were reviled, others quietly respected. A few, over time, became wealthy, but most lived in the margins, always present, never embraced. And when they died, they were not buried in hallowed ground. Their resting places were marked outside the churchyard walls, in corners overgrown with grass. Yet the executioner was part of the system, essential, enduring. His hands carried the state sentence when no one else would. His silence steadied a scaffold. His footsteps echoed behind the justice that others merely read about. As the day fades and his tools are wiped clean, he returns to his home at the edge of town. No one greets him. No one speaks his name. And from this quiet retreat, we return now to the world of imagined justice, where stories, legends, and fears mixed to form punishments that were not always real, but were believed deeply nonetheless. Not all medieval punishments were enacted by courts or scribes. Some were imagined, woven from whispers, shaped by fear, and carried from hearth to hearth as cautionary tales. They may never have been inscribed in law or carried out in truth, but in the minds of the people, they were real. These were the punishments of folklore. In the quiet villages and scattered hamlets, tales of extreme justice drifted like smoke. Some were warnings passed down by grandmothers. Others were half-remembered stories from travelers. All carried the same purpose: to guide behavior, to mark boundaries, to remind listeners of what could happen. One such tale spoke of a bell made from bone, rung only when a child disobeyed the church's teachings. If it rang, the earth would open. There is no evidence the bell existed, but the story shaped obedience nonetheless. In another, a baker who cheated his customers was said to be visited at night by a ghostly procession of those he wronged, dragging chains, whispering his name, leaving his bread crumbled to ash each morning. No record survives of such hauntings, but in towns where no inspector came, the tale served as its own enforcement. Some myths imagined torture devices far more elaborate than anything truly used. The Iron Maiden, so often associated with medieval cruelty, has no reliable record from the period. Its image rose later, shaped by modern fascination with horror. But in stories, it loomed, a sarcophagus of spikes, a silent threat. Others warned of cursed judges who handed down unjust sentences and were themselves swallowed by the ground in retribution. These were not accounts of real magistrates, but fables, told to reassure that justice, if not served by man, would be served by fate. Children were taught to behave lest they be taken by a travelling punisher with iron shoes. Wayward youths were told of towns where liars' tongues turned to stone. No laws enforced these things, but the stories clung like damp folklore, in this sense, was not merely superstition. It was a form of cultural memory. It filled the gaps left by inconsistent laws and inaccessible courts. It taught right from wrong, when the formal system was too far, too slow, or too silent. And even today, echoes of these tales remain, in idioms, in nursery rhymes, in the way we speak of justice as a figure blind, robed, holding a scale. These myths remind us that fear and imagination can carry more power than the rod or rope. They are the shadows cast by justice, lingering long after the flame has gone out. And from these imagined punishments, we move now to one final contrasting view, the elite few for whom punishment was never truly punishment, but a change of scenery, a short-lived disgrace, or a temporary step away from the center of power. For most people in medieval society, punishment came with noise, bruises, hunger, or shame. But for the highest ranks, for dukes, high-ranking clergy, and royal favorites, the consequences of wrongdoing looked different. Their sentences, when they came, often unfolded behind thick stone walls, embroidered drapes, and silvered goblets. They were punished, yes, but in comfort. Imagine a nobleman found guilty of treasonous correspondence. The court meets. A sentence is declared. He is to be confined to his country estate until further notice. That estate is sprawling. It includes a chapel, several gardens, dozens of rooms. He is not beaten. He is not shackled. He is simply removed from court, from influence, from the ear of the king. Servants still attend him. Letters may still be written. Though inspected, food remains plentiful. And while the air of disgrace settles around him, the trappings of his life remain nearly intact. This was common. Such punishments served their own function. They distanced the offender. They sent a message. But they also preserved bloodlines, land, and delicate alliances. To imprison or execute a nobleman was to risk rebellion. To exile him quietly was far safer. In other cases, nobles were sent abroad, not as fugitives, but as ambassadors, crusaders, or penitents. A royal cousin accused of corruption might be ordered to make pilgrimage to Santiago. A bishop caught in scandal might be reassigned to a distant, lesser diocese. The consequence lay not in pain, but in loss of proximity. The loss of whispering power in a monarch's ear. The absence from the feast, the absence from the decisions. And often, these disgraced nobles returned. Time passed. A new monarch rose. Alliances shifted. The man once sent away had returned to favor, resume his place, and step once more into the great hall with only a murmur of his past disgrace lingering behind him. This ebb and flow was known. It was expected. And it reminded everyone near power that punishment, at those heights, was not always permanent. Of course, not all were so fortunate. A few were imprisoned in towers, starved, even executed. But most particularly those with the right friends faced softer landings. Their punishments were not felt in skin, but in stasis. Their world narrowed, their voices quieted, but their lives remained filled with velvet, firelight, and silver plates. From this contrasting corner of justice, we now arrive at the final bend in our journey, a closing reflection. One that brings together all we've seen, all we've imagined, and all we carry with us, even now, in the still and quiet dark. By the twilight of the medieval period, change was already underfoot, markets were still crowded. Town criers still rang their bells, pillories still stood. But the age of punishment, as performance of visible, communal correction, was beginning to give way to a new model. One quieter, more bureaucratic, less immediate. And yet, the echoes of the older world did not vanish. Imagine a town square in the early 1500s. The stocks are still there, but more often empty. The town jail has grown in size, its records thicker. The gallows on the hill are used less frequently. And when they are, the crowds feel different, less reverent, more curious, less certain. Justice has begun to move indoors. Trials are now more formalized. Evidence matters more. Written law holds increasing sway over custom. And with the growth of royal authority and centralized courts, local punishments lose some of their grip. The role of public shame softens, branding declines, ordeals vanish. Torture, once sporadic and often extrajudicial, becomes a codified tool of state. Then eventually questioned and abandoned, the executioner remains. But even he senses the change. He's summoned less often. The gallows are repaired more slowly. New systems, carts of appeal, royal pardons, penal transportation begin to shift the weight of punishment away from the body and toward the state. And yet, some things linger. The ghost of the stocks, the memory of a cart filled with rotten bread and a shamed baker, the bell tolling for a noble's disgrace, these symbols do not disappear. They retreat into stories, paintings, expressions. They become language, they become myth. And the people, now shaped by newer fears of prisons, of exile, of fines, carry the memory of the old ways with them, often without realizing it. Punishment in the medieval world was many things: a tool, a performance, a warning, a rhythm stitched into the lives of rich and poor alike. It was flawed, uneven, and deeply human. And as it faded, it left behind not only artifacts and records, but emotions: fear, caution, humility, resignation. A legacy of order held together by presence, repetition, and spectacle. From the high stone towers to the muddy lanes of village greens, the old justice receded, slowly, but not without imprint. And now, as this journey draws near its end, we leave the cobbled streets and the worn wooden stocks behind, and turn inward to reflect, to exhale, and to let the silence of the present carry us softly forward. And so, our slow walk through the long shadow of medieval punishment comes to an end. We've passed through crowded squares and candlelit courts, through cold cells and quiet cloisters. We've stood beside the stocks, heard the ring of the town crier's voice, watched the dipping of the cucking stool, and felt the silence of the jail. We've seen justice carried out in iron and parchment, in laughter and in fear, in names recorded and in memories erased. We've seen that punishment in the medieval world was not only pain, it was presence, a constant companion in daily life. Sometimes cruel, sometimes ceremonial, often deeply ordinary. It shaped how people moved through their world, what they said, where they stood, how they measured risk, apology, and power. But as the centuries turned, as kings fell and cities rose, as books spread and silence deepened, the spectacle softened, justice moved indoors. The body bore fewer marks, the mind carried more. And now, in this quiet moment, far from the pillory or the scaffold, beneath soft electric light, or tucked beneath the quilt in the stillness of your night, the distance between then and now feels both vast and strangely close, because punishment is still with us, transformed, but familiar, in rules spoken and unspoken, in systems written and assumed, in what is remembered and in what is left behind. But here, in this space, you are safe. The world of stocks and ropes and ritual procession fades into quiet. The rhythm of torches and tolling bells has slowed, and the heavy doors of the past have gently closed behind us. If you're still awake, thank you for spending this time with us. If you've drifted off, we hope your rest is deep and peaceful. Please remember to subscribe if this journey through time helped you unwind tonight. And we'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it was when you press play. Until next time, may your sleep be long, your dreams soft, and your nights quiet. Good night.